These early tractors weren't made by the Ford Motor Company, but by a separate company Henry Ford founded with Edsel, his son. It was called Henry Ford and Son, and made the Fordson tractor. The Model T car was being used for ploughing long before the first Model F arrived, and many companies both in America and in Britain were making conversion kits. Lugged rear wheels, a gearing mechanism to reduce speed, extra engine cooling, and a frame for hitching implements were needed. These kits were sold as something which could be fixed to the car for ploughing and then taken off for the trip to church on Sunday. But in practice, of course, they were left fixed to the cars when the cars were past their prime. Fordson tractor design experiments went on for 10 years and well over 100 prototypes were built. This first model, driven here by Henry Ford, was made in 1907 and used a lot of Model T parts, including the engine. Some had their engines mounted to one side, and it's rather hard to see in which direction others were actually driven. It seems that the world's first tractor cab may also have been designed by Ford's engineers. The now familiar 4 wheels, engine at the front and seat at the back was eventually favoured, and in 1915 the engineers Eugene Farkas and Joseph Gallam, working with Charlie Sorensen, built a prototype which was to become the Model F, then the N, and finally the E27N Major.
The story began more than 50 years ago. This was a story that had a dramatic beginning. The time was 1917. Europe was plunged in the conflict that came to be known as World War I. Britain had, over the years, become industrialized. Farming had suffered. 2/3 of all food supplies for more than 40 million people came from over the water. But in the sea war, submarines were sinking Allied shipping at the rate of over 500,000 tons a month. The question was, how long could the strictly rationed food supplies last? The British knew that agricultural production could not be increased with 1 or 2 horsepower methods. An entirely new concept was needed. Concepts are created by men, and the man who was to provide the right concept was across the sea in Detroit, Michigan. His name was already known everywhere: Henry Ford. In 1917, the Ford automotive plant, the largest in the world, was producing cars at the rate of more than 300,000 a year. Even though Ford's primary interest was in transportation, he had been a farm boy, and he had always dreamed of making farm work easier and more productive with mechanization. For more than 10 years, he had been experimenting with gasoline tractors. Was it possible to design a machine that could be manufactured in quantity to sell at a low price, yet provide ruggedly reliable farm service? By 1917, after years of intensive work, a model had been developed that seemed to provide the answer. With his son Edsel, Ford had incorporated a company to build the new machine. The firm was Henry Ford and Son. The tractor was to be known as the Fordson. It started on gasoline, ran on kerosene, and developed 20 horsepower. More than 50 experimental Fordsons were built, and 2 were tested in Britain. The British saw them as the first simple, reliable, inexpensive tractors that anyone could operate. Since they planned to put demobilized soldiers and housewives to work in the fields, This was important. Lord Northcliffe, representing the British government, came to Dearborn to discuss the manufacture of the Fordson in England under close Ford supervision. If there were to be enough of these machines to solve Britain's food problem, it would be necessary to produce them in quantity. But the plan was disrupted by a new phase of the war, the battle for the skies. All of Britain's available factory facilities must be turned to the production of aircraft. Without hesitation, Ford switched back to the alternative of building Fordsons in Dearborn. They worked night and day in a new and unexplored field, an operation that was a lot different from the manufacture of cars. But in spite of all problems, on October 8, 1917, the initial units were completed. They were the world's first mass-produced tractors. Production was slower in the beginning, but through the winter, the pace accelerated. The last of an order of 7,000 machines was delivered to beleaguered Britain in April 1918. Later, a British government spokesman stated, without these machines, the food crisis in all probability would not have been surmounted. As the machines continued to roll off the assembly line, Henry Ford knew he had fired the opening gun in a wider war. A war that would go on long after the European conflict had passed into history. This was a war on hunger, a problem of worldwide proportions. This was a war on farm drudgery. Without mechanical power, efficient food production was all but impossible in the world of limited topsoil and ever-increasing populations. Ford called it power farming. He said, power farming is simply taking the burden from flesh and blood and putting it on steel and motors. This was the beginning of a new age. After Britain's tractors were delivered, mass production made the Fordson available at low cost to American farmers. They took to it on sight. Down the years, the manufacture of this revolutionary tool continued in high gear. And by 1925, no less than 500